Hey guys, this is Holistic Health with Harry, and today I'm joined by a very special guest, Ashley Aurora, who is now my new Facebook friend. And I've been watching
Yay.
your stuff for a bit. I'm talking to you, Messenger too. But yeah, I mean, geez, it's funny how we were put on. Actually, it was because one of my friends um had like Stockholm syndrome from another of my friends who I recently broke up with, and one of the reasons was because of that I'd seen abuse and Stockholm syndrome, and I'd never seen anything like that in my life. And then one of my friends said, "Why don't you?" He tagged you, and said, "Why don't you add this girl and interview her?" Because he knows I always interview people. I like to learn. So I was like, okay. And then yeah, this was a few weeks back, and here we are, with you, Ashley. So welcome.
Here we are. Thank you, dear friend. So we're going to talk about Stockholm syndrome. May I read something to provide an illustration of what Stockholm syndrome looks like?
Of course, yes, please.
I wrote this a couple years ago. I think it was 2020 or maybe 2021 as we watched the whole world transform overnight due to COVID. Okay. Imagine being locked in a dark, windowless cell by your psychopathic captor for years on end, wrestling with haunting terror of the next moment of abuse and torture, while your body starves for hydration to provide your degenerating organs with the nutrients and water it needed to survive. In the beginning of your imprisonment, you stayed faithful, clinging to each passing hour, hopeful that some type of intervention would eventually arrive and break you free. Your mom used to recite the Lord's Prayer every evening while you were just a child, and you held on to that prayer during your captivity. Grandmother shared miraculous stories about how Aunt Susie was healed by the preacher man who laid his holy hands on her. Those memories of hope kept you alive in those early days as you were abused and tortured by your oppressor. You experienced onslaught after onslaught of psychological manipulation, emotional trauma, sexual violence, and physical torture every other day, slowly breaking you down, slowly eroding your faith in divine intervention, slowly extracting the minerals in your body, slowly draining your soul from your heart. You attempt to escape, but there are no cracks in the walls, no makeshift tools to help you dig your way out. You attempt to fight, but the abuse occurs in pitch dark and you are too weakened, too small, too unskilled, and lacking physical defense training. Slowly, you begin to succumb to hopelessness and despair. The psychological torture is beginning to reveal its efficacy in conditioning you to believe that you're absolutely powerless. You're a victim, and your abuser, your torturer, is the powerful one. Each time they abuse you in your helplessness, the belief in their infallible power is reinforced and affirmed within your psyche and then your neurobiology. Your entire neurological makeup has now been transformed. It has been rewired to reflect a complete amnesia of your inner power, your faith in the human spirit. Now that your neurology has been hardwired for terror and trauma, your abuser shifts their behavior and starts to prolong the intervals of abuse and torture. They even start to bring you one warm meal a day, rather than just crumbs of stale bread. They offer you a blanket to cover your shivering body as you curl in the fetal position day and night on that cold floor where your urine and feces lay. Your mind now begins to associate your abuser as the only person who will keep you alive, offering some warmth and food and protection. You basically become dependent on your abuser for your survival. They start to become your friend, the only person who feeds you. God is not breaking you free from that torture chamber. Your parents are not here to rescue you and bring you back home to your dog. Your friends have long forgotten you as they went on to travel and live out their lives. You start to create stories in your mind to justify this idea that they're your friend, your protector. Initially, it appeared absurd to your rational and logical faculties, but you started to question, and because you need to survive, because your mind is spinning and too confused, you decide that they are not too bad. The abuse continues, interspersed with moments of affection and more incentives. Now the belief that your abuser cares about you begins to solidify. Your abuser may have tortured and starved you for months on end, but now they're offering you some food and warmth. They may even be doing God's work, and you're the one who deserved to be abused and punished. You start to create rationalizations for this thought. Maybe you're here because of karma. Maybe because you're dying a slow death in this cell because you tortured someone in a past life. Yes, that must be it. The bond becomes stronger between you and your abuser. You recall a memory where you once attended a hippie-like gathering with your friends to listen to a talk by an authority type guy from India. He sat with his legs crossed on a pillow and spoke to the audience about something called karma. He said that everything bad that happens to you is because of bad things you did in a past life. This is what you tell yourself in order to justify the constant slaughtering of your mind, body, and soul. The abuser becomes your protector, your hero, and your savior. You're dying and you're under total control, and the only way to cope with this reality is by believing that your abuser loves you and is a messenger from God. Nothing can convince you now that this abuser is psychopathic. Even if your best friend broke in and unlocked your cell, offering the chance for freedom, you choose to stay here, believing the lies your abuser told you during the nights they sat in your cell, offering you the only touch your body has felt in years. Your friend now becomes your enemy. The neurobiology has been hardwired. Your soul is now fragmented into 1,000 pieces. That abuser could be your spouse, your boss, your president, or your best friend. This is how Stockholm Syndrome works. Long, but thank you. Wanted to have the dramatic effect.
Well, that worked. That worked.
Mm-hmm. It's intense just reading it. I'm like, whoo!
Yeah, that was good.
And so,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what happens, right? In the 70s in Stockholm, Sweden, there's I think it was 2 individuals who went to rob a bank, and they held 4 bank tellers hostage for 6 days. And they were, I guess, kind to them. So the hostages had said, gave them food, let them stretch their legs. And when they asked for ransom money, I think like a blue Mustang, like all sorts of crazy stuff. Eventually, the police give them all their demands and they release the hostages. But the hostages don't want to go. And they're protecting the captors, these bank robbers who held them pretty much at gunpoint the whole time while, offering them some affection. And so this story, was talked about throughout the world, and psychologists coined it Stockholm Syndrome, of why in God's name would these people sympathize with somebody who put them at gunpoint and kept them there beyond their will for 6 days. And, as we learn more about neurology, we see that what fires together wires together. This is why so many of us have gone through trauma bonds and situations, especially in childhood, if we were raised in a home where love was equated with abuse. Literally, the brain has been formed to reflect this. So that's like the backstory of Stockholm Syndrome. And I'm curious about any like reflections that you have right now about what I read and what I just said.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Well, first of all, I think there's a movie. I was trying to remember the name as you said it. With Al Pacino or some famous actor in the 70s. So yeah, and it's great to watch movies because they exemplify what it is. And second of all, whilst you were talking, I was thinking of the case that I witnessed, because obviously my experience is going to be more powerful than just like a book, and it's different. And I think there's different examples of Stockholm Syndrome. Maybe I'll get into it later, but my one is like a spiritual, because there's a guy that's spiritual and there's another guy that's spiritual, and I'm friends with both of them. And yeah, it's an interesting case of Stockholm Syndrome. And yeah, I'll talk to you maybe later if it's appropriate about it. So I think it's a complex subject that I want you to unpack, because yeah, I find it fascinating why people can abuse, why you can feel like someone that's causing you harm is good. Like, yeah, I just find it interesting.
Oh, it's a survival. It's a coping mechanism. And I know it very well because I've done it myself in my life. And it's really sad and very challenging when you start waking up to your own lies that you told yourself. In developmental psychology, we would call it maladaptation. So, especially in early childhood trauma, we have to adapt because in a lot of ways, kids are pretty helpless. who was it? It was Martin Seligman. He's, I think, over at the University of Pennsylvania. I did a dissertation on him in college. And he talked about this notion called learned helplessness. But eventually he came to revise his theory in that we actually all start off helpless. Obviously, we come out of our mother's womb and we are completely dependent upon her, right? And so if our basic needs aren't met in those formative years, we have a much higher risk of going into trauma bond situations that could produce the collective of symptoms that people call Stockholm syndrome. You know, from some personal experiences as a child, I was really abused, and I really loved the abuser.
Did you? Yeah.
And I think there's an innocence to that, you
Yeah.
know, because there's a fragility to the human heart. And I don't say that in a negative way. The fragility is the tenderness, the sweetness, the innocence, you know, of the human heart and its capacity to love and to share that love with others. But it's a bitch of a situation, because ultimately, if I'm hardwired like that, now I've noticed that I've had to spend my adult life relearning. And it's been very, very challenging because I've had a natural inclination to go into those types of dynamics and not even see it, and thus be a part of a cycle. And so I think that my goal here today with you is to provide empathy and compassion, understanding that this is a cycle and a lot of us have been in it, and it does take a lot of work and a lot of energy, but it is possible to rewire our brains.
Yeah. Can I ask why do we so the response to sympathize with people that are doing bad to us, that keeps us alive, does it? And says it's okay. Like, I mean, yeah, I mean, is it, as a kid, obviously you don't know that someone's doing, you're a kid, right? You haven't got your brain isn't developed, so you don't know how to take responsibility, what's right and what's wrong. So I understand from a kid's perspective. So that can carry on beyond childhood as like a habit of like where you're always putting it on as it's not other people's fault what's gone wrong with you. And is it something like this?
It is. I think the thing is that when we will be attracted, and I'm not talking about law of attraction, stuff like that, but we will be attracted to dynamics, relationship dynamics, whether it's a romantic partner, whether it's you know, a work situation, that feel familiar. It's the somatic history. It's the somatic patterning that we will naturally have this inclination to go. I mean, all the years of my research, me being a domestic violence counselor and all sorts of stuff, I knew this intellectually. And yet I still had this gravitational pull towards certain individuals who, when you get in these dynamics, it gets really messy because there's also the psychological warfare component. So, you know, if I'm in a relationship with somebody and I have a suspicion that that person is not being in integrity, in monogamy, if we choose monogamy, and I have a suspicion, and I address that suspicion by just asking a question like, hey, I'm curious why you and that woman keep talking all the time, and why did you go to your exes and lie to me about it? Like, that will come back of, you're so insecure, Ashley. Like, what the fuck is your problem? You don't trust me? And so when you've already have kind of a damaged self-esteem,
yeah,
those things come into you and they penetrate you. And unfortunately, we believe lies, the father of all lies.
Yeah, I can so relate. And I was thinking as well with the instant that I know the Stockholm syndrome, what I noticed was because my other friend, he does the same with all of us. Should I explain a little bit if you're interested?
I would love to hear, yeah.
Okay, so he was my best friend, and we've hanged out for many years, and he's still a cool dude. But the way I see it was that everyone that came in his life, including me, like he is a light worker, but he was like, I'd say overtly toxic masculine, as in he tried too hard to bring out your shadow and to try and transform people, because he's very smart. But and I can say this on reflection, all these things, these weren't observations I made at the time, and it harmed me, but I'm kind of a bit stronger. And the boy that the other guy that's a light worker too, that eventually got into the Stockholm syndrome when my friend was bringing out his shadow. So my friend cared, and he was bringing out his shadow with all of us. And I can handle being around that, but it did hurt me over time. But with this guy, what I felt was he had much lower self-esteem. He'd been through a lot worse than even me and a lot of other people. And because my other friend cared, he pushed him too hard into his shadow self. And two big things happened. First of all, he pushed him so hard in his shadow self relentlessly and didn't accept him as he is, that he actually turned into what I'd call psychopathic, like almost full on. And I mean, mimicking fake crying, which is nuts. If no one's ever seen fake crying, wow. And
Crying?
Fake crying, like crying,
Wow,
but crocodile
that's
tears.
that's
Like
a major skill to have. You can go to the Oscars.
yeah, but my other friend, who gave him Stockholm syndrome, pushed him into this by putting him too much into it. Was too much, too intense. And yeah, that was one thing. Yeah, he pushed him right into it. And second was, it got physical because my friend was so fed up that my other friend wasn't changing. There was a block in his brain to seeing reality correctly, that he eventually got physical with him. And then it was really weird because some of these physical activities I was in the middle and witnessed from both of them and my friends. And what I'd hear from the person who had Stockholm syndrome, my other friend, he'd say to me, Harry, what this other guy's doing is okay. Right after I'm witnessing physical violence, I would hear from the victim, oh, Harry, I deserve it. It's okay. And that's very crazy for the person that cares, but is violent, but caring too much and trying too hard. And it's weird for me to witness someone say, yeah, but it's okay. That kind of Stockholm syndrome is really nuts to me. Like, and that happened not just once, like quite a few times.
This is unfortunately so common. The statistics, I can only speak for women because I only know this stat, and statistics are what they are, but it says on an average, and it might be similar for men, it takes a woman 7 times to really leave an abusive relationship. And there is all of these rationalizations that we create. I saw myself do it. I created rationalizations. And I really would like to talk about the role of the spiritual community. And oftentimes the notion of non-dualism can be a mind fuckery. And how I have met more predators in the spiritual community than like those who are not. Predators abound, and we all have an inner predator. I have one badass inner predator. I've made stupid choices. I've reacted in domestic violence when somebody is being abused. Oftentimes they reach a capacity, and then what happens is that they react, and then it becomes reactive violence, and that's a part of the cycle. It sucks. And it happens pretty much with everybody who's been in a trauma bonding situation. A little bit different than Stockholm syndrome, but I think it is important to talk about the role of spiritual precepts and how they have been weaponized often. And a lot of people struggle with the actual embodiment of what they read. And that's okay. We're human. We're on this path, but I feel like the new age has been directly linked to, psychological warfare and a psyop.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I resonate with that too.
Because it was kind of like what I talked about on my Facebook Live yesterday, is if a woman goes and is walking home from a late night class from campus and she's trying to get to her student housing, and a perpetrator comes and grabs her, throws her in the back of a van and rapes her, some people have taken it to a level, and I think that this is actually reflective of people in the spiritual community their Stockholm syndrome, where they say, well, you must have been vibing at a certain level. You must have been in negativity or something. Maybe she found out earlier that day that she lost funding for graduate school. Like, who knows? Like, shit happens. Life happens. Some days we have shitty days. We're allowed to be human. What we do is that we're almost denying our humanity in lieu of spiritual moralism, which I think is really, really, really dangerous.
Are you saying like if, what the community pushes is like our spiritual communities, that if something bad happens, then you've got to look at yourself as accountable somewhat? Is that what people believe?
Yeah, and see, I can even see my body, the way I just responded, because we do want to be responsible, right? But like, what would you say to that woman? Like, how would you tell a rape victim that she's not a victim and it didn't happen and she has to be responsible? I think the responsibility is, unfortunately, because it sucks, she's going to have to be responsible for receiving the healing that she needs.
Yeah.
I think that's the level of responsibility that I would say. To touch on your friend, how he kind of became psychopathic. We have the stories of the Zen masters like smacking their students upside their heads. Or I posted something yesterday about the Heyoka, and I know that archetype well. I can push people. But I learned that we have to be very careful, like when we're doing shadow work, because if we focus too heavily on the shadow, we create a monster. I think that for years I was focused so much on my own shadow work because I just had this persistent guilt, which I've realized is survivor's guilt from being abused as a child and very neglected. And so I focused heavily on shadow work, but it consumed me in a deeper way. And it led me into greater forms of addiction, which ultimately that addiction bled out and hurt some people around me, So we have to be careful. There's a gentleman who wrote the book. I forget his name, but this is his name, Paulo Freire. If that I might be butchering his last name, but one of the things that he wrote in his book is he was looking at society, especially totalitarian regimes or government oppression or violence against its own citizens. And what he observed is that the oppressed oftentimes will become the oppressor. That's the cycle. And so, like, when you're talking about your friend getting pushed too hard and his level of vulnerability, that's what it sounded like. He was being oppressed, and then himself became an oppressor. And I think that this is something that any of us who've been abused, we have to look at how now, from the effects of it, how we may be impacting others around us.
Yeah, can I just come back a little bit? So you're saying that my friend, he was literally pushed into a demonic state by my other friend who really cares, but in a toxic way, where he didn't give him the space to grow. And I've learned on my journey, for me and for other people, the only way you can make someone sincerely grow in this crazy environment of work we have to do on ourselves is to encourage them and be an example, but don't push them too much in the shadow. It was nuts, because I'll say as well to my ex-best friend, pretty much everyone that went there had the same experience. Whether it was physical, I got physical. He got physical with me once. We've been good friends for ages, and I never thought he'd get physical with me. But a few months ago in Costa Rica, he did get physical with me, and as soon as he did, I'm glad I was at that stage of development in my growth where I think, fuck, if you're gonna get physical with me, I'm done. From the first touch, you and me are done. All contracts end. But my friend just accepted it with the Stockholm syndrome, and everyone else that came to visit him. This is how I recognized the patterns he was doing it wrong. Nearly everyone had the same experience of like wanting to run away and eventually running away. So one of my exes went there as well, and she tried to run away 3 times and she got away the 3rd time. So in a way, it sounds abusive. he was a light worker, but the way of, yeah, the way to push people too hard really fucks things up. I want to come back a little bit when you said, so the guy that got my friend that got Stockholm syndrome and he went into psychopath mode. Would you say that he's the oppressor? Because you made a comment earlier that he was the oppressed, and then he wasn't like physically violent back, but he did become psychopathic. Yes. Hold
Yeah,
on.
like he was oppressed, and he's literally recapitulating the trauma. That's what's happening. When I was in a situation similar with an individual who pushed me and pushed me in similar situations, and they had got physical with me, and I got really trapped. I was in a situation of immense entrapment. And I mean, if I could have left, I would have. But there was particular details that were happening that it was like, it was almost like it felt like I was being kidnapped and held hostage. It wasn't like but like people around me who saw what I was going through were like, holy shit, Ash. And eventually, like, so basically, I went into a hypo aroused state. I went into freeze. I couldn't fight in that moment, and I couldn't run. And when we don't have the option to fight or flee, we will go into freeze.
Yeah.
And that is where we get into all of the Stockholm syndrome, the coping mechanisms, the rationalizations, uh, ideological systems, beliefs. I mean, the world is like built on this. Eventually, I don't know, I think I cracked, and I became mean, and I got violent with this human being. I kicked his ass.
All right.
And I don't say that like from a prideful, it's sad because I never want to be brought into that state. And also moving that energy, because he committed some really cruel things to me, like almost felt satanic, like crazy stuff happening. Me being able to move out of freeze and go into fight saved my life, really.
Yeah.
So it is very, very real. And one of the things that I also want to say about your friend, so psychopathy is something that there is a lot of evidence that it is genetic and that they're born psychopaths, right? But why do we see such a prevailing amount of people who exhibit sociopathic or psychopathic traits? And that's where I would point people to the work of Wilhelm Reich. In his work, understanding character, like it's a character analysis. And what he does is he observes the soma, he observes the body. And so people who have more psychopathic traits have more rigidity. We'll say up in the shoulders, up in here, it's tight, right? They have a certain body stature. And what Wilhelm said is not necessarily like these are the full-blown psychopaths, like the CEOs and the politicians who like govern the world. But they have a rigid character structure. And so literally energy has been locked. And so I would say with your friend, the trauma that he experienced and without being able to move it through the electrical system made him become rigid. He froze to some degrees.
Yeah.
And you'll see this with people who can never get out of their heads. They're always in their heads. They're constantly thinking. They can't rest and digest. People who are just very, very mentally focused. We would put them in the character structure of a psychopath. I remember I was doing like couples counseling with a partner, and he was demonstrating a lot of psychopathic traits, and it was terrifying for me. And when we were working with a couples counselor who was a Reichian student, I asked him one day alone, I said, what's my character structure? And he's like, you have like the oral. So this is where my addiction patterns have come in. You know, I didn't get to suck on mommy's breast enough when I was a baby or some shit like that, right? And Wilhelm will say that we all have a little bit of everything. I could see the hysteric or the neurotic or the psychopath. I could see it in a bit of all of us, but some people have more of a prevailing. And he said to me, when I asked him about my partner, he said, yeah, he's the psychopathic character structure. And in that moment, I was just like, holy moly. And do I think the guy is a full-blown, like, cold, like, has no empathy? No. People who have more psychopathic tendencies, their empathy centers will light up through MRI studies we've seen when they can relate interpersonally with somebody who's been through maybe something they have. We've also seen in some studies, however, that when a psychopath sees a victim react, it arouses them. It arouses certain regions in the brain and increases the level of psychopathic behavior.
React negatively or just react? What do you mean? React like to a trick or a deception, to a lie, to some game they're playing?
Yeah, like if let's say I'm having like a conversation with a person who has much more higher psychopathic traits, and I'm emotional, right? Like emotions are like blood to psychopaths. They're like a shark. A shark is attracted to blood. And this is very challenging for people who've been through a lot of trauma. We struggle with emotional regulation. That's the whole goal, is learning how to regulate our emotions and come down into our window of tolerance, and living from that flow state of the window of tolerance, where it's okay if we get hyper aroused, it's a part of the amygdala, but we don't want to always be there. But when a person is getting hyper aroused and getting really upset and emotional in front of people who have more of these traits, it will increase the predator's tenacity to predate, basically. So I think it's like we have to understand that we do live in a predator-prey world. We do. Nature is predator and prey. It can be kind of brutal here on planet Earth.
Yeah, it is completely. And culture, I feel, is set up. The way culture is set up is almost at the very top psychopathic, whilst pretending not to be. And this is why we all come down here with so many crazy issues. It's almost like the psychopathic modeling and values of a born psychopath are like what they want for everybody, and they're trying really hard to put it in into all our structures and systems. And yeah, it does get passed down into people, especially when we feel disconnection and by ourselves and no one understands us. We get put into these places of where we can do evil things to other people,
Absolutely. And it is like, I'm glad that you said that, and we went back to that, is we are seeing a reflection. Like, society is impacted by these regime structures, these political structures and systems. Wilhelm Reich also talked about the sex economy. It's good book, very heady, but he looks at our sex, our sexuality, how we express it, how we embrace it, how do sexual pathologies arise. And he noticed a positive correlation between societies that are more oppressed by a regime system and the way that they relate to their sexuality. I think that Reich wasn't always fully accurate, but I think it tells us, because when we're thinking about sexuality, think about chi in the body, the meridian system, right? And we're going back into the rigid structures and places in the body that may have stagnation or blocks that contributes to this, more of a pathological nature of a society. We see this in America with hyper individualism. Most people in the spiritual community and a lot of like, it's all on you, like you can be anything that you want to be, do this, and it places so much emphasis on the individual, and it's a distraction from looking at a system that is literally imprinting the consciousness of man, woman, and child. which I find to be very dangerous. I like to take more of a sociological perspective in these things. When we see cases of Stockholm syndrome, whether it's between just two individuals, whether it's in a church, a cult, a political party, you know, these are all also reflections of what's happening on the greater level. Yeah, challenging stuff.
Very much so. And how does one break free from so if one finds themselves going down the rabbit hole of sympathizing with people that don't, we know logically, because what you were describing is interesting. You said that, so you knew, you were getting to a point when you knew that this wasn't like, why am I sympathizing with people that done me harm? But so you know logically not to, but I think you said, correct me if I'm wrong, that you were still sympathizing with them, even though you knew logically it was wrong. Because like, I think that's like, sounds like growth to me. First of all, you have like, if say I'm deeply negative, deeply in my brain, and I know I've got to start thinking good, but I'm on a roll with negativity, so it's going to be really hard. So I can relate to you there. But how did you get to that place? What steps did you take? What steps are there to take when you know you're going down a dangerous rabbit hole of sympathizing with people that don't deserve it, but you're still doing it? What is there steps? Is there ways? Is it just a case of literally like, oh, just keep thinking about, I know they're doing wrong, and that will just manifest it by itself, the freedom to fully realize they have been wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still in a journey of recovery from all of it. And I want to say first that it is so very important that we have to look at ourselves and our contribution and how, as adults, okay, I'm not going to talk about children because again, they are much more vulnerable. But as adults, you know, what are the belief systems? What are the thought patterns? What are the pathologies? What are the addictions? What's going on inside of us? How are we relating to ourselves? And applying compassion for ourselves as well as that personal accountability. You can know all this stuff textbook, and I see a lot, but it takes time to literally rewire the brain. So while you're doing this internal work where you're self-inquiring and you're saying, you know, why do I struggle with people pleasing? Why do I struggle saying no? Why didn't I leave when I could? Why did I ignore my gut feelings about somebody? Dr. Clarissa Estes Pincolas, she wrote the book Women Who Run with the Wolves. One of the things that she calls it is an instinct injury. She talks about it with women, but men can have it too, because men have intuition as well. We're connected to spirit, you know. But that injury occurs when there has been a significant impact of abuse. And so recovering our instinctual self, I feel so important. My instinctual self is very strong. And at the same time, I had all of these programmings that would ignore that. And so it was also very injured, right? I would ignore it. Some people don't see, some people can't feel it, but every single person, and I'm not going to label them as psychopaths or all bad people. I think there is some grace in it, that there was lessons to be learned on both ends in particular situations. But eventually it comes to starting to really honor your intuition. When you get that, no, this isn't going to be good for either of us. I took a big step in like the workplace in 2019, in the fall of 2019. I was a domestic violence counselor, and my boss really had a lot of trauma, but she wouldn't recognize it. She wouldn't admit to it. She wouldn't explore it. This is what I see with a lot of people. And so she demonstrated a lot of like borderline personality disorder issues. She would often yell, degrade, scream. I mean, it was pretty bad. She never really messed with me because I was one of her best counselors. And I kind of just like kept quiet and kept to myself and was just like, okay, she is who she is. And I could see her heart come out. But I remember one day we were at a staff meeting, and we were talking about a case study of a client, and I said, you know, I really feel, and she hated that because she was a cognitive behavioralist. When I used the word I feel, she's like, no, it's you think, Ashley, you think, and therefore you are. And I'm like, okay, like I can understand that, but like so she started to scream at me and degrade me. And my instinct kicked in and said, thank you so much, I quit.
Did you? Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was a really hard decision, but just like think about all the variety of ways in which people are in Stockholm syndrome, especially because of an economic system, especially because they have mortgages, they have car payments.
Oh, I was just going to say, there's an aspect of codependency with this that, coming back again to my story, that is why he put up with the abuse. And what my other friend actually, okay, listen, like, I think consciously or unconsciously, he made us all codependent on him. So you'd come into his life, and because he needed us for business, truthfully, and not growth, for business, he needed us for business, he would make us codependent on him. He looked after us so well, the abuser. He looked after us so well. He'd cook us food. He was an amazing vegan chef, and he was, in a way, really caring. He still is. But because he looked after us so well and pushed us too hard, when we went into these states of like, I knew intuitively it's no good being around him, and it took for me to get the physical violence for me to leave him. Yeah, basically because I felt like I couldn't do it by myself. He made me feel these things, and I lost my independence. I lost my power, is what I felt being around him. Like,
yeah, you're spot on, Harry. You are absolutely spot on. And this is where I feel that this is the realm of compassion we need to go to, because especially in the self-help psychological community, there seems to be, you know, a shame that comes with admitting that you were codependent in a personal situation. I think most of the world is codependent upon something. Yes, we want to strive for interdependency, but the complexity of these dynamics are I don't think it's fair that we shame ourselves, because I've been through the same thing. Like I was like a vulnerable single mom, and I saw men who knew I was in vulnerability, who knew that I was going through struggles and I was exhausted, like really like be there and like want to support me, and then shit changed, and then it was like weaponized against me, or their kindness or any support, and I was like, wow, this is a mind fuck, this is crazy. You just really abused, and it's hard not to shame ourselves, because I'm like, fuck, Ash, that led to some really intense consequences for my life, for my health. I went deeper into addiction, and we have to have compassion and have these conversations, whereas honesty can help to de-shame us. We provide this space to talk about these things. I think that a big part of healing and recovering from these type of situations is healthy community. But in the beginning, for somebody who's recovering, it's going to be hard for them to find healthy community, because remember, what fires together wires together. So they're used to abusive dynamics, and they will again naturally gravitate towards them. What I did, like after I got out of a very dangerous situation, I went in self-isolation for a while. I went into practical hiding. One, because there was certain very, very dangerous people that they could not know my whereabouts. Two, because I couldn't trust any person. I knew that I had to be alone. And there's criticism of that, like self-isolation is dangerous. Fortunately, like not in nature, and I have a dog and things like that. But eventually when you go back, I've seen it with myself, like when you start to wanting to build community, you have to take it really slow and be really careful. You really have to trust your gut. You have to discern. You have to stop bullshitting yourself. You have to admit that there's parts of you that are still healing and still in distortion, and you may not always see things clearly. And so you have to be really pragmatic, I feel, when entering into a new community space. People are so vulnerable. Like, think about why so many people are in the spiritual community, and why especially women, so many women have been predated upon by spiritual guys, and they were susceptible almost to joining this kind of spiritual cult because of what happened to them as a child. Maybe they were molested or something. And there's the human need for belonging. So we got a challenging situation when we have a human need for belonging and for connection and for intimacy and vulnerability and emotional transparency. And yet when you've been in Stockholm syndrome, when you've been really abused, you're not going to always be perceiving correctly. Or, which I have done, you become armored, like you can't open up emotionally. Or if you do, it brings up so much that you're going to have to process. So for individuals who've been through this stuff, the key is take everything slow, like slow with yourself. Understanding healing takes time. It's not like this magic pill that we can take, Harry. I believe I believe like there's some cool stuff. Like I believe in physical exercise. We see that a lot of just physical activity helps to move trauma out of the body. So staying active, staying in movement, nutrition, diet. So the brain can absolutely heal. It can rewire. It takes a lot of work, but with things like nootropics, herbs that help with the brain, as well as, mycelium, all forms of mycelium, psilocybin. It's been shown, like there's so much evidence and research how it helps with hyperplasticity of the brain. So I think that people, to really recover, you need to approach it on every single angle. And it's a lot of work. And know that you're going to take 5 steps forward and like 3 steps back. And that's how the process happens. I noticed this year healing, I took massive steps forward, like super OG style. And this is when I wasn't talking to really anybody. I had a couple close friends, but I was very alone and just in nature. Once I went back out into social media and I kind of started to reconnect with people, I took 5 steps back because it just brought up so much for me. And I've really had to learn, like, I have to be my best friend here, and I have to have compassion and understanding that that's the rhythm of healing, and that's how it happens.
Yeah, I can almost understand, because you just put yourself back in the same environment, thinking you've done all the work probably, and then you put yourself back in that same environment with all the same triggers, expecting yourself to be Jesus now. Don't know. It does take some time, doesn't it?
It does. And yeah, that's I've learned to never overestimate, ourselves. We want to have confidence, and we want to believe in ourselves and have faith and hope and trusting that we can recover and we can heal. And we, if anything, we can use the situations that we've been in, all of the abuse that we have experienced, the mistakes we've made, the ways we've abused ourselves, in consequence of it. And we could take that and alchemize it and turn it into an offering, a sacred offering for others to help them in their own journey and their own growth. But it takes time and honesty.
It does.
This past week, I learned some information around a mega betrayal that somebody really close participated in. And I was gaslit when I found out from this person, not the person who betrayed, but another person who was colluding with the whole situation. And I was gaslit, well, blah, 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 blah. And it's that person, I keep them at a very big distance. But it brought so much out, and
Is
I've been,
gaslighting just making you think you're crazy when you're not, basically?
yeah,
Like,
it's like if I say I'm drinking like water, I'm drinking water, and they're like, no, you're not. You're
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 drinking beer.
you're you're drinking whatever. So it's literally denying your reality and your experience, and trying to replace it with something else,
Hmm.
which the whole world is gaslighting each other, and we often gaslight ourselves as well. But what I noticed this week when that situation arose, I've been angry. I've been an asshole to some of my friends. And I feel so like I felt sad this morning. I was like, God, and I'm like, okay. And like my friends know that I've been going through a lot recently, but I'm like, nope, I'm gonna go back and just be alone for a couple of weeks and make sure that I don't bleed on people. Make sure that I don't become the oppressor. Make sure that I'm not reacting, that I am really fully centered into presence. Um, One of the things that I do want to share is around religious principles. So take Christianity,
Hmm.
Jesus, right? I wasn't raised in the church, but I was raised in a culture with deep Christian values. I was also raised around people who would often justify abuse or make justifications for other people's abuse as a coping mechanism, Stockholm syndrome, right?
Hmm.
And I think that it's really hard for a lot of us because we have these principles, and maybe they do come from the spirit, the living spirit within us, the living gnosis, the divine intelligence that says, yes, forgive thy enemy, love thy enemy, turn the other cheek, all these things. But when we take these concepts and we apply them in really dangerous situations, we're essentially allowing a psychopathic culture to prevail.
Hmm.
And one wonders how much, there's a lot of revisions that happen in the scriptures, as we know. There's a lot taken out, a lot that wasn't included, a lot of mistranslation and misinterpretation. How much has these kind of larger regime systems used religion as a form to keep people subservient? I think we all know that the answer to that question.
Yeah.
So yeah, any other reflections or questions?
Yeah, I find it interesting. So the religion thing, like, I get it. I mean, you want to make them a better person, but if there's a lot of activities that are very dodgy going on in religions and stuff that harm other people, whether there be a lot of physical abuse, for example, that in my mind would create trauma and what religion doesn't want, they say, which is demonic activity and all kinds of weird stuff where people are pushed in traumas, you know, entities from other worlds feeding off the shit that they do, which is a bit of a paradox. That you want to become a better person by doing these things, you're actually making things a lot worse for the world. It's a bit crazy.
It's absolutely crazy. I've seen some crazy shit in some of the Christian communities. Um, that is like very, very high strangeness. A lot of supernatural activity that they reference to Christ and the Holy Spirit, but what I discerned was like, no, this is not from the Holy Spirit or Christ. This is like some alien shit going on here, some interdimensional fuckery happening. Like, I was in this one town and it has this huge, huge mega church and Christian community. And I remember one night meditating and I could just feel the entire field. And I'm like, something's off in this town. there's something really weird going on here. It felt like the whole town was under like some spell, some mind control spell. Like maybe it was like some intelligence experiment to see how much, whatever, they can siphon people's energies. And I remember one night going for a walk. It was like kind of late at night. I was going for a walk with my dog, and I just wanted to feel into the energy of this place. Like, what is this? What am I picking up? This is when we trust our intuition, right? We get that feeling. And I ended up hanging out with some street kids, homeless kids. They were kind, and they were like showing me around the town and telling me about this mega church that was in the town, and like all the stuff that they're doing, buying up real estate, doing some of their sermons in Masonic lodges, paying off the police department. I mean, like, come on, people, we know what's going on. Getting lots and lots of money during COVID, when they gave churches like a relief fund, millions of dollars they got. You can thank, Trump and everybody else for supporting that. And so, it's unfortunate, but a lot of these churches, not all of them, I've met some really good people that they don't seem as indoctrinated. They just have a purity of love for God. And they believe in Christ, and I honor them. But there's a Jesus that I feel some of these communities are worshiping that ain't no Jesus. It's something else.
Yeah, judgy Jesus.
Judgy Jesus. Oh my God, it's hilarious. I've never heard anybody say that.
You can definitely quote me. There is something else, but it's not related to the religion thing. That when you said the fawning thing, so like I just think back to myself. Like I noticed how I've rolled since my trauma and all this, and I've got a lot better, but I still recognize it's still inside me. How I react is fawning actually. So I never fight, and that's not necessarily a good or bad thing. Like I don't run away, but I do just stand there and freeze, and I freeze and I freeze and I freeze. And I used to be way worse with it, but even now I notice that reaction. I don't fight. Yeah, I just don't. Yeah, I just freeze, and it's weird. And I relate to what you said, and I've seen on a few of your videos that, and I've seen also Peter Levine's work and all that stuff. The animals, and you've got to shake. Like when something happens, an animal just shakes and it disappears. But if I've been freezing when these things have gone on, it's just stayed stuck in my body, and it's a response that's a habit now. And then I've got three responses. I can freeze, which I seem to be doing, run away, which is probably the best one. But sometimes I can't run away. And then I can fight, and fighting's not in my thing. That's not what I'm going to do. So yeah, I just think that the fawning aspect of isn't talked about as much as the fight or flight. It's a good one, the freezing thing.
Yeah. I think there is more awareness. They call it the fourth stage of trauma. I forget the gentleman's name who coined that. One of the things that is important is that when you're in like the post recovery trauma work is really important. Okay. So you can fight, right? So let's say today, like maybe you still have some freeze in your system. You can literally start to visualize and just start working up and getting your fight system activated. There's all sorts of, ways that people who've been trained in trauma therapy work. There's all sorts of ways, but basically what we're looking for is the discharge of energy, that shaking, what you're talking about. Like there's TRE, which I've done before. And I have found personally, like, I do Vipassana, right? So I go to these 10-day meditation retreats.
Do you? Me too.
Awesome. And the last one I went to, I had gotten myself out of because what I went through a succession of trauma bonding experiences. Because people be like, well, what are you doing? It's like, remember, my brain's all fucked up and is being wired really crazy right now. And I'm not seeing things. That's like the real addiction. I think my other addictions were like reflections of that real addiction in a lot of ways. But when I went to this Vipassana, like when I go, eventually I get to a state where I don't sleep anymore. I am just in meditative, theta zone, right? And when I go into those deep states, I mean, the amount of trauma that gets released from my system, and it can feel a little jolting at first because it's an intense experience. But you're absolutely correct. And we want to be engaging in whatever practices that we can to discharge the energy.
Yeah, you just encouraged me to go back to Vipassana. I used to say, I was said like 4 years ago, I go to one 10-day every year, but I stopped doing it last year because of traveling. But I'll get back on that. Yeah, it's really good for that stuff. I also noticed in the Vipassana, people would get angry. Like, I wasn't judging, but it's always interesting when you're sitting in a meditation hall and just people spontaneously just cry or run out. All these emotions and traumas coming up. Right.
Oh, it's huge. And I think it's important that as somebody who's been through a lot of trauma, it's not going to be good for them. They need assistance in other ways, maybe like EMDR or things like
Oh,
that,
interesting.
somatic therapy,
Yeah.
things like that. Because yeah, I had my first one I ever went to, we're in the meditation hall, and all of a sudden this woman starts screaming, "We're all gonna die! We're all gonna die!" And she like runs up to me, "We're all gonna die." And I was like, "Yes, we are."
You're not
And
supposed to talk, are you? I don't know in your one. You talk, do
oh
you?
no, we're not allowed to talk.
And she does.
But this lady's like screaming in my face. And yeah, she went into psychosis. She had a
Wow.
psychotic break. And God bless her, I don't judge her. Like, she probably went through some mega stuff. Like, maybe she was, a veteran who was in, the Afghani war or something. I don't know. I remember one time in one of them, the second one I think I did, I started just spontaneously crying and I could not stop. And I have some criticisms. For me, it's like, it's almost militant. It is a very strict disciplined form of meditation. And I remember like they asked me to go out of the meditation hall and I was crying and they were trying to get me to stop crying, which
Really?
really ticked me the fuck off.
Hmm.
Because they will say that if I'm crying at this level and rate, what I'm doing is I'm increasing sankharas, right? You know, the sankhara.
Hmm.
And I don't see that perspective, because I look at it symmetrically. Like, if I'm having this release, I'm literally releasing it somatically. Crying is a form of a somatic expression. Everything is the soma. Everything is the soma.
Hmm.
And there's other things about them. I think some of the teachers are into a lot of spiritual bypassing. Like, I had one teacher and I was talking to her one day, because we're allowed to talk to the teachers, right? And she mentioned something to me of how she had a granddaughter. I said, "Oh, that's so wonderful. Like, how far does she live?" Or she says, "I haven't even met my grandmother or granddaughter yet. It's been 2 years." I said, "Oh, how far does your daughter live from you?" And she said, "Oh, only about 8 hours." And I said, "Why haven't you visited?" She goes, "Yeah, maybe I should." And I was just like, whoa, whoa, like, you're sitting here in meditative practice and you're teaching this. So yeah, there can be, again, mega blind spots that if we go too deep into non-dualism, spirituality, and it becomes a form of identification structure, we can have a tendency to dehumanize ourselves and one another.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't Vipassana, for example, say that all trauma can be released through removal of Sankara or something? You just keep doing this meditation and dedicate yourself to it, you can achieve a state of pure oneness bliss in the 3D where nothing bothers you anymore, and you can walk like we imagine a Buddha with people just saying whatever you want and you're free, which sounds great, but I don't know.
It sounds great in theory, and I think that innocently we would all love to get to that place where I'm never going to react to nothing no more. And it's just, would you say that to a mother that just lost her child? You know what I mean?
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think that some of that culture, it's coming out of India, it's coming out of a Buddhist practice, but it has been dominated a lot by a male culture. It's very patriarchal. Okay. And so I think it's like what you shared with me today when you voice memo me. You said something about like the feminine and the masculine expression of compassion is different. You know, it can be. And the masculine, like there's times when I need that masculine presence to be like, Ashley, get your shit together, girl. Like, you need to get your shit together. And sometimes I'll be like, Ashley, enough. Stop reacting. Like, refocus your mind, girl, and let's move forward with the day. We're not crying right now. We're not having an emotional breakdown today, honey. And then sometimes I need to have that compassion of the feminine that's like, I will hold you while you cry. So it's a balance. And so I think that's what's needed in these spiritual communities, is that we need the balance of the masculine and feminine. We don't want too much feminine. We see what that's doing to the world right now. It's dangerous. The whole goddess movement, like, that's beautiful, that we love the goddess, we love the earth, we love the feminine expression, but it's not complete without the masculine, you know?
Yeah, I agree.
This is how life operates.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And the balance between you, which has both of them, and I definitely subscribe to that, that we have both masculine and feminine inside us, is where our true highest growth and removal of trauma and just the compassion to be our best selves and to grow comes from. And that's also factors the same into relationships. And I feel guys have more predominantly masculine energy, just the way we're born. And then women obviously have more feminine energy. And then you learn to balance your own out. And then with partners, sometimes you can learn the sometimes good relationships balance each other out, and you know, all these kind of things. But yeah, life is that balance, and that's hard to get, but it is what it is about.
Yeah, it is. I just learned this interesting fact the other day, that when men wake up, they get a jolt of more testosterone.
Really?
And that helps to mobilize the action orientedness of the masculine. And what this person was saying is, women don't get that hit in the morning. We get that hit when we're menstruating,
Right.
but we don't have that same biological drive. Like, and this where I think feminists would get pissed, because the feminist movement really strove that women are equal in all things, and we can work 40 hours a week and we can do all of this. But the more that we see the science, it's like, no, we have different biological makeups.
Yeah.
Women are biologically designed, and I know it varies between women to women. Some women have more drive, you know, it varies. So I don't want to homogenize it and put women in a box of what they should do. I support a woman's choice of how she wants to live her life. But I think it is worth noting. And if a man doesn't understand that, like if she's like, move slower in the morning, or it doesn't have a jolt to just like go and start the fucking day,
Yeah.
it's important that he doesn't insult her or call her lazy. There's something wrong with you. And it's like, no, we're wired very differently. We have different, you know, chemical, hormonal, biological makeup.
Yeah, I resonate and vibe with that. I mean, like, I feel like the sun is the masculine in a way, and the moon is the feminine. And then like the sun is the daytime, so the man is more active. Even though the women obviously were all active in the daytime, it's more our time. And then when it comes to sunset and maybe around the fire back in the day, the women come alive dancing, and that's their time. When they're predominantly in their element. And yeah, it makes sense to me what you're saying. And maybe women rule the dream world too, because that's the moon in the dark. It's more predominant in you than us. You know,
Absolutely. So I want to, it's interesting how the conversation flowed, but maybe there's something here, is what can we learn about how to heal from Stockholm syndrome by creating, some people don't like the word balance, we can say harmony between our own inner and feminine and masculine. You know, what's lacking for a lot of us when we're in freeze is we're kind of lacking that fire of the masculine and the awareness and the consciousness that he's a genius with, you know. I see masculine as like the fundamental nature of consciousness itself and the ability to act. He's the boundary field. If we don't have that strong understanding and relationship with our inner father, of course we're going to get abused. Of course we're going to walk ourselves in situations and allow ourselves to be subjected to things that don't feel right, even if we create rationalization for it.
I feel
And
like,
then
yeah, sorry, I feel like the masculine is clearly the safe space, the grounded safe space that observes and tries his best not to judge. Whilst the emotions come in, you just got to be like present.
yeah, exactly. And then maybe with the feminine, it's like, because I think that's like really in a lot of ways, that's what happened. It was like, I had a friend once and he said to me, Ash, you're like drunk off of empathy. I was like, damn, you just called me out. But he, right, like it was a trauma response, but like, and I have a lot of compassion, you know, like I don't like to kill bugs. Okay. Like I like to put them outside. It could be this like huge ass wasp who's like trying to kill me. And I'd be like, hey, bro, like chill. Unless it's a tick, I will kill a tick. But you know, I think that I was drunk off of empathy. And was it even true empathy? Was it true compassion? I wasn't being compassionate enough for myself and listening to my own needs. I was stuck in a cycle where I'd have tremendous compassion and I would try to understand. That's what often happens, is that we start to fixate on the other. We try to understand them. Why would they do this? Well, this, and that. And like, that's beautiful. That's beautiful that we have that reflective capacity of cognition. And at the same time, though, I would get stuck there. And then I would get angry. And then I would react. And then this whole dynamic, just over and over these cycles. And so really the balance, like this past year, what I've like some of the deepest work I've done is around the father energy, very, very deep father energy, and really coming into healing my inner masculinity. And I think for a woman, sometimes it's hard because if I have, like, I was in situations where I'd have a boundary and I'd be like, no. And if they kept asking, I would get fierce. And it's like, no, or I'd call shit out. I've learned that now these days, I'm not going to call as much stuff out unless I have a true investment with a good soul who may be struggling. You know, like when my friends call me out, they're calling me out and they know that I'm a good person. You know, they also know that I'm being a bitch in that moment, or I'm off my rocker for that day. I'm not emotionally stable. But yes, as a woman, it can be challenging because I think a woman with strong boundaries, we've often been gaslit around that. The goal of a more sociopathic person is to erode your boundary system.
Whoa. Yeah, that's
Whether
some crazy statement. Yeah, agree. Because when they go, all hell breaks loose and they can get in whatever they want from you when the boundaries go.
yeah. So a couple things that I would like to share that could help others. One of the biggest things I've learned. So I would be in situations and I would try to elicit an empathetic response from that person. I'd be like, can you understand where I'm coming from? And like, I talk about it and talk, like, can you understand? Or like, help. No, what you have to do is that you have to get honest and recognize that you're dealing with somebody who doesn't have a true capacity nor willingness to change.
Yeah.
You're playing games.
Yeah.
Exit that and withdraw all attention.
Yeah.
Don't focus on them. It's dangerous. I've successfully removed almost pretty much everybody in my life who I understood doesn't respect me as a human being, except one person in particular, and I have no choice. They have to be in my life. So removing yourself from these situations, removing attention is really, really, really important. A lot of the times we go to our abuser to find healing. That's what I did. until I had to really be accountable and be like, nobody's saving you, Ashley, especially not this homie who abused you, who hit you,
Yeah.
who took advantage of you sexually. Like, no, he's not. And it's sad, but it's a response mechanism, because we do feel so powerless, because we do feel so codependent. You said earlier, like that guy elicited and almost it's a like an entrapment, you know. Think about how many, especially I know women who they meet some guy online, they're having a hard time in life. The guy's like, oh, come visit me and I'll take care of you and this, and she goes, and then she's trapped. This happens to not only women but men. I've just known a lot of women. You're not going to hear as much of these conversations, I think, because it's hard for women to talk about it, and there's shame that comes with it, because we ultimately a lot of times blame ourselves.
So the man, sorry, he invites some lady he likes into his life and then doesn't let them go because he's got some kind of, what is it, the psychopathy or trauma himself. Like he's expressing control issues.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like I heard a new word the other day. I think it's called drovo.
Okay.
Drovo. Is it drovo? I've never heard this before. I saw it in some video. But basically, I'll have to fact check that. I might be wrong. Something. But oftentimes the codependency and the identification as the victim becomes more and more solidified when, let's say, your boyfriend's cheating on you or your girlfriend, and you know it, and you go on their phone and you look at their DMs, right? And you address them, say, hey, I saw your DMs with that girl, and I know that you went to her house last night and y'all were doing whatever you're doing. What happens with an abusive person is that they're going to twist it on you. And they say, well, what were you doing in my DMs? Now, I'm not advocating for looking and invading people's privacy. If you want to do that, you probably shouldn't be in the relationship in the first place. But we're human and we want to understand, we want to find out truth, right? And so it gets twisted on them, and the whole focus goes on what that person who looked in the phone did wrong.
Yeah.
And basically now the abusive person becomes the victim and the other person is now the perpetrator. This is like classic. This is classic psychological warfare.
I've seen that. Yeah, in my life. I've seen that. Crazy.
It is crazy. It's crazy making. And so that's what you find. Like, I think the thing with Stockholm syndrome is that there is a fear response. So let's go back to Sweden. Of course, there was a fear response initially. That's a smart biological reaction. It's that fear is supposed to, like, okay, now fight or flee. And they couldn't do anything, right? And now they're in this situation where I think the guy shot like a police officer, and they are now ultimately absolutely dependent upon the bank robbers and the people with the guns, because those people are the only chance of their survival. How fucked up is that?
Yeah, the guy with the gun is the only chance of you surviving.
I think that this is why, like, I have some criticism of the feminist movement, but I understand why it happened, because you have a pendulum effect, and that pendulum swung, and women were still being very abused and under, living with a lot of abusive men. Violence against women, United States ranks 17 at 191 countries. Wow. Afghanistan is some of the highest. South Africa is some of the highest. I think Guatemala is up there. So that stuff does exist. Women are vulnerable. Okay, they're easy prey, basically. You got people like Andrew Tate who groom young men to teach them how to be a predator. It's crazy. Talk about Stockholm syndrome. And his followers, I know he says some good stuff, but you know, um, he's essentially grooming millions and millions and millions of young men to be misogynists and to justifiably treat women not
Can I
well.
interject? I've also, I don't know, I disagree slightly with that. I have a different angle. I don't want to criticize too much, but only because I've heavily was myself involved in pickup artistry. It was what I thought I wanted, and I came good from that actually. So that's what I thought I wanted, that kind of style of life of just sleeping around, cold approaching girls and getting good at that, and that's the life because that would fix me. But it's funny how that actually changed my brain. It really made me more positive. It really took me out of a dark headspace into not hating on women actually. Instead of like feeling like there wasn't anything there for me with them, it made me think like I'm abundant. I don't need to worry about girls in the end. So,
Oh, I
but it
see.
does trap a lot of guys for sure. But there is a higher vibe aspect to the community, and I've heard about Andrew Tate a little bit, and I just know that other guys that teach those things in the past have been criticized wrongly in the media. He might be correct in your criticism of him, but I just know that it gets construed as misogynistic and completely just want to fuck girls when there's actually the guys that coach it are quite spiritual and quite deep with what they do. It's not all about, the act of just sex and stuff. But yeah, I don't know in this case with Andrew Tate what's going on.
It's interesting. It's almost like a reverse psychology thing. So what you're saying is that when you were learning that stuff, it built your confidence and
Yeah,
you didn't have as much of a maybe a hidden resentment towards women anymore because you felt unworthy, but
yeah,
now you felt more worthy.
yeah. It made me more
Yeah.
positive. It made me feel like I could just talk to girls and just communicate. I couldn't even socialize with girls that I liked. So it was just nice. It was fun. It changed me. And
Yeah.
it wasn't my path, although I wanted to do that actually. Like in 2015, 16, I was like, I'm going to be a dating coach. And then because I was so traumatized, actually, that actually stopped me getting good because I actually truthfully have approached like probably more girls than most guys in UK. Like, I mean, I'm not even lying, but I was so bad because of the trauma. Like, so I got good for a few minutes, but I never got good because if you got trauma in you, you can't be authentic. You can't be that cool dude or whatever, that authentic person. You've got to work on your traumas. So I'm glad that quickly that I'm in this community because I'm really here just to help people and remove the shit that I've created or other people have created for me inside my body.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that the alternative perspective. You know what I mean? I think for me, I guess it would just be how does a man view a woman? How does he treat her? Is he lying? Is he manipulating? Is he entrapping her? Is he promising commitment, going behind her back, um, getting her pregnant and not showing up as a dad? I think those would be bigger factors
Yeah.
that I would have to like look at as a, if this helps a guy learn how to talk to women and have sex with beautiful women that are consenting, well then that's that. I think there's nothing wrong with that. If as long as it's fully consensual, people are allowed to live the lives that they want, you know. So yeah, interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing it up.
Andrew
Yeah.
Tate's interesting. Like I don't know him personally. I've tracked him a bit. I've watched him.
Yeah.
Again, some of his shit is really good. You know, he puts out some good stuff, but I think that I'm looking at it more in his sociological impact and
Right.
who he's
Yeah.
really tied to. I learned today that Andrew Tate's father was CIA.
Oh,
Um,
really? Okay, so I'm with you and I didn't know these things. Yes. Okay.
yeah, and like there's just a lot of like, things and his level of influence and how he got there. He says that he was poor growing up, but like if you look at pictures of him when he was a kid, I don't think that boy was poor. So I
Right.
think that there's just some stuff. And he also started a webcam business where he would basically recruit women and he got rich. And like he admitted that he would train these women, command them basically to manipulate like old men, drain their fucking pockets to the point that they have to go get loans, lie and manipulate like these sexy ass webcam models, right?
Hmm.
And convince these old white dudes that, you know, they'll be her, like she'll be his wife or something. That, when we get into those realms, that's what I mean. Like,
Yeah.
and you'll see the women who surround Andrew, I'm like, y'all are in Stockholm syndrome. You know, like, yeah, I know he's sexy and he's got a bunch of money and like he's a powerful dude, you know, and he also, you know, he's kind of exploiting others to make money and to make him powerful, which actually makes him a weak ass bitch.
No, I hear that, what you're saying. That makes sense. And he's
Yeah.
got a big influence. I wonder where his influence came from. Maybe it's linked in with the dad and all this stuff, and he's been set upon. Maybe he's being put down a false path. Um, so yeah, I hear all those
At the end
criticisms.
of the day, I don't know fully. I've never met him. If I met him in person, I would know immediately. You know, my body and my soul, my instinctual self would be like, okay, you know. So I think that's important. We have a tendency to really want to judge, especially some of these bigger people, you know. And at the end of the day, it helps when we actually meet somebody and we can, you know, discern ourselves.
Yeah.
So getting out of Stockholm syndrome is first coming out of denial. It's like
Yeah,
an addiction.
I like
And the
it.
first step to
Yeah.
healing addiction is not actually abstinence. It's getting out of denial
Yeah.
and starting to come to terms and understanding how much, you know, you were been wired to being in Stockholm syndrome, right?
Yeah. I
And
mean, the day that changed my life was the day I stopped denying what was going wrong. I just went like, do you know what? You carry on like this, you're gonna be fucked. You gotta look at yourself, man. You gotta do something. And I didn't imagine it would take this long to get to whatever level I think I'm at now. So yeah, it's a tough, long slog, but it can be fun and it is worth it. Like,
yeah. And you just nailed it. It is, you know, something's got to change. And ultimately, we do have to change ourselves. We have to change. Like whatever patterns of behavior that brought us in, again, as adults, where we turned a blind eye. Now, this is more relationships or work relationships, because there's a whole other level. Like if some dude comes on with a gun on a bus and holds it hostage, it's a whole other level. But when it comes to more of the interpersonal, when we've consciously made a choice to move into some type of dynamic with somebody, we have to take responsibility for that. There eventually has to come to a point where we come out of denial by admitting how broken we feel, how
yeah,
sad we are, how traumatized we feel, how fucked up we have felt, how much we've been lying to ourselves. And actually going, I find that really trauma healing, yes, there's discharge from the electrical system, but it's also about grieving. It's actively allowing yourself to grieve things that you lost, the ways that we have betrayed our own selves in some regards and lied
yeah,
to
really coming back
ourselves.
to your Vipassana. Stop crying. Get back onto your for 10 hours a day meditation. Quit your crying, fool.
Every time I do a retreat, I just cry the whole time.
Is it?
I have so much, I've had so much grief obviously in my life, and life has been really challenging for me. So, but I find it to be sacred and healing because it's just like a cleansing rain that comes, and I let myself really feel it, and I'm safe, you know, and I have the time. It's unfortunately our culture is Western society is particularly is very grief avoidant. Don't want to grieve. We don't want to admit how deeply we love something and lost something. I've noticed this past year, I had to grieve really deeply of years that I've lost to my own blind spots, to my own mistakes, to my own addictions and sufferings, and how it subsequently led me into these particular Stockholm syndrome dynamics. It's not easy, but if you apply compassion to the process, it's a little bit easier.
Yeah, you're amazing, actually. I just want to say as well before we end that, you know, I really appreciate our connection and your knowledge and your wisdom. And I think you have a great balance to me of like divine feminine and masculine energies. and that's really cool. And I know you're helping people with what you do just by being you, and that's really cool. And thank you so much for doing this with us. I really appreciate it.
It's an honor, Harry. I appreciate you so much, and thank you for your contribution in the world. And I bless your trip to Mexico,
Oh
right?
yeah, everybody
Soon?
knows now. That's cool. No, of course. Yeah, I'm gonna. Thanks.